In the morning Walter Boyd lost the words for his own name. He was worth $110 million and could not remember how to ask the nurse for water. He lay in the largest room on the neuro floor at Mercer Greenville with a view of the foothills he had spent 40 years building toward. And for 9 days, nobody came. Not the son who lived a 20-minute drive up Highway 25. Not the daughter the hospital had reached by phone before he was even out of the CT scanner. Not one of the regional managers from the chain of hardware and lumber stores that carried his name across 3 states. The only person who came was a woman who had not drawn a paycheck from him in 11 years. She came on the 10th day with a folding stool under one arm and a covered tin in both hands. And when the charge nurse asked who she was to him, she said she used to cook at his first store, and that he had once been good to her in a way that cost him something, and she had never gotten the chance to pay it back. Walter Boyd was 69 years old, broad through the shoulders even now, with hands that had never quite fit the soft cuffs of the shirts his second life required of him. He had started at 17, sweeping a feed store in a mill town called Caldwell that does not appear on most maps anymore because the mill closed and took the town's reason for existing with it. He swept floors, then he stocked shelves. Then he learned what a 16-penny nail was and why a man framing a porch would pay a nickel more for a straight one. By 22, he was running the register. By 30, he had borrowed against a truck and a wedding ring to buy a failing builder's supply outfit. 2 counties over, and he had stood in the empty store the first night after closing the deal and felt, for the only time in his life, completely sure of what he was doing. That store became 2. 2 became 9. 9 became a regional name with a green and white logo on the side of delivery trucks that ran from the Blue Ridge down to the coast. Boyd Hardware and Lumber, 41 locations. A distribution center the size of an airplane hangar. An office tower in downtown Greenville with his name on the glass in letters you could read from the parkway. He had done it the slow way, the only way he knew, which was to be in the building longer than anybody else and to remember the name of every man who unloaded a truck for him. What the trucks and the tower and the glass letters did not tell anyone was the part Walter kept folded up small. He had married Joan when he was 26, and she was a bank teller who counted his deposits and decided early that he was going somewhere. For a while she was right, and for a while that was enough. They had 2 children, Grant and Sylvia, and somewhere in the years of growth Joan had come to love the size of the thing he was building more than the man building it. They divorced when the kids were nearly grown. The proceedings were quick and expensive and left the kind of quiet between 2 people that is colder than any argument, the quiet of 2 people who have run out of reasons to need each other. Joan got the lake house and a number with a lot of zeros in it, and she raised the children the rest of the way on her own particular gospel, which held that the only true measure of a person was what they were owed and what they could collect. Grant Boyd was 41 now and ran a strategic development division at the company that existed mostly so he would have somewhere to be. Sylvia Boyd was 37 and lived in Charleston and had been on the company's board since she was 30, a seat that had been her father's idea, made back when he still believed that time and proximity would turn his children into people who understood what he had made. He had been wrong about that for years and had kept hoping anyway because hoping cost him nothing he could see on a balance sheet. The woman who came on the 10th day was named Della Mercer. She was 56. She had been born in a town in the low country that people describe by what it lacks rather than what it has, and she had started cooking in other people's kitchens at 19 because that was the work that was there. She had a way of knowing what a kitchen needed before the kitchen told her. The same way she could look at a man's plate and tell you what kind of week he was having. Her husband Sam had passed 11 years back. A heart that gave out in the cab of his truck on a Tuesday with no warning at all, and she had buried him on a Friday and gone back to work on a Monday because the rent did not pause to grieve with her. She had 1 boy, Andre, grown now and living up in Charlotte with a wife and a baby. He called every Sunday, and every Sunday he told her to come live with them. And every Sunday she told him she had things to tend to here, and never once named what the things were. She had cooked the lunch counter at Boyd's first real store for 9 years. Back then, every Boyd location still kept a counter at the back, where the framers and the roofers and the old men who came to argue about weather could get a plate for $4, and Della had run the one in Caldwell. She knew that Walter took his coffee black with 1 spoon of sorghum molasses stirred in slow, in a dented tin camp cup he refused to let anyone throw out. She knew he ate his cornbread, crumbled into his pinto beans, and never the other way around. She knew he hummed an old hymn under his breath when he was working through a problem, so quiet most people never caught it. The same 6 notes over and over. She knew which of the men who came in were behind on their own bills and which ones Walter was quietly carrying on a tab that never got collected. The counters closed the year the company modernized. That was Joan's word. In the last stretch before the divorce, when she still had a hand in things, and it meant cutting whatever did not show up as profit. The counters showed up as profit only in the way that loyalty shows up as profit, which is to say, slowly and never on the quarter you need it. Della got a call on a Thursday. She thanked the manager for the years. She loaded her knives and her cast iron into the bed of her car and drove home. She did not resent it. She moved through it the way she moved through everything, with all of her attention on the next thing that needed doing. What nobody at the company knew, because Walter never told a soul, was the reason he had kept Caldwell's counter open 3 years longer than the numbers justified. 11 years before the stroke, before Sam Mercer died, on a winter night when the divorce papers were already drawn and the bank was making noises about a loan that had gotten too big too fast, Walter had driven out to the Caldwell store after closing and let himself in, and sat in the dark of the back office, certain he was about to lose all of it. Not just the money. The thing itself. The proof that the boy sweeping a feed store had not imagined his whole life. He had put his head down on the desk in a closed store at 11 o'clock at night, and he had cried. Not the way a man cries when something has just happened, but the way a man cries when he understands that something has been true for a long time and he has only now stopped pretending otherwise. Della had been there. She had come back for a coat she'd left on the hook by the walk-in. She saw the light under the office door. She did not knock and ask if he was all right, because she could see that he was not, and the question would only make him answer it out loud. She went into the kitchen instead. She lit the flat top. She made him a plate of beans and cornbread and a tin cup of coffee with sorghum in it, and she set it down in front of him, and she pulled out the other chair and sat, and she did not say a word. She let him be a man falling apart in a chair instead of a man who owned the building. She stayed until the plate was empty and the worst of it had passed, and then she gathered the dishes and washed them and dried them and set them in the rack, and she said, "Good night, Mr. Boyd," and she drove home. Neither of them ever spoke of it again, but the next month and every month after, until the counters closed, there was an extra $100 in Della's pay envelope with no note and no explanation, and the Caldwell counter, alone among all of them, stayed open 3 years past its time. The stroke came on a Sunday morning in his kitchen, which the doctors would later say was the only piece of luck in the whole thing, because his housekeeper found him by 10. An ischemic stroke, a clot in the left middle cerebral artery, the territory of the brain that holds language. By the time he reached Mercy Greenville, his speech was gone. The right side of his face had slipped, and his right hand lay in his lap like something borrowed. They got the clot. They saved his life and most of his body. What they could not promise was the rest of him. Grant arrived 4 hours after the call. He had been at a charity golf outing and had finished the round. He found the attending neurologist, Dr. Naomi Okafor, in the hallway, and the first word out of his mouth was not "Dad" and not "alive," but "incapacitated," and Dr. Emil Okafor, who had been practicing for 26 years and had learned to read a family before anyone in it spoke, made a note of the word and answered only the medical questions and not the one he was clearly building toward. Sylvia flew up from Charleston the next morning and did not come alone. Beside her in the corridor was a man in a pressed gray suit carrying a leather portfolio, an attorney named Preston Marsh, whose specialty, Dr. Okafor would later learn, was guardianship and conservatorship. Sylvia stopped at the nurse's station and asked about emergency signatory authority and the threshold for a competency finding before she asked which room her father was in. They went in together. Walter was awake. The monitors kept their patient rhythm. Grant stood at the foot of the bed and said, "Dad, it's Grant." And Walter looked at him with an expression that was not hostile and not even confused, only absent, the polite blankness you give a stranger in an elevator while you both wait for the doors. Sylvia said her name. Walter's eyes moved to her face and worked at it the way you work at a name on the tip of your tongue. And nothing came, and his eyes drifted back to the ceiling. They stayed 11 minutes. In the hallway afterward, Grant told Marsh they should move on the trust before the board appointed an interim chief, and Sylvia, pressing the elevator button, said she had already started the paperwork on the flight up. The doors closed. Down the hall, in the room they had left, their father lay with his good hand moving slowly across the bed rail, his thumb finding the seam in the plastic and pressing it, finding it and pressing it, over and over, the way that hand had pressed the edge of a straight nail for 50 years to feel whether it would do. For the first 3 days they came, both of them briefly and always with the portfolio. They spoke to each other across his bed about the board and the filings and a number Sylvia kept lowering. They spoke near him and around him and never to him. On the second day, after they left, Walter looked at the nurse and worked his mouth and could not make the words, but his face asked the question plainly enough. And when she understood it and answered yes, those were his children, he turned his head to the window and was quiet for a long time. The nurse, whose name was Coretta, did not write that in the chart. She thought about it through the rest of her shift. By the 4th day, Grant came every other day. By the 5th, Sylvia called the station instead of coming, and her calls were about competency timelines and never about how he was sleeping. On the 8th day, Grant came one last time and brought a document, a durable power of attorney, and he set it on the bedside table and explained it the slow way you'd explain a thing to a child. That it was just to protect Dad, just to keep things moving while he got better. Walter could not read it. The letters were letters, but the meaning behind them was a country he could not get to anymore. He could not read the page, but he could read the man, and what he read was somebody in a hurry to be finished. He pushed the paper an inch back across the table with his good hand. He did not sign. Grant took it and left and did not come back. Days 9 and on, no one came. The room was large and very clean. The morning sun came in around 7:15 and crossed the floor in a slow diagonal and reached the far wall by noon, and Walter watched it travel every day without knowing he was watching it. The television stayed dark. The phone on the table never rang. On the 9th day, a nurse wrote in his chart that the patient was calm and cooperative and had no visitors logged in over 72 hours. And that when she'd asked if there was anyone he wanted them to call, he had looked at her for a while and then he had shaken his head, slow, and turned to the window. Della found the article on a Wednesday at lunch. She cleaned rooms now at a hotel off the interstate. $16.25 an hour. And she read the local paper on her phone front to back the methodical way she did most things. It was a short item, 4 sentences. Boyd Hardware, founder hospitalized after stroke. It gave his name and the hospital and not much else, because Walter Boyd had never been the kind of rich man who turned up on magazine covers. He built things and did not talk about building them. She set the phone down on the break room table. She did not finish her sandwich. She thought about a kitchen and a flat top and a man with his head down on a desk in a clothes store. She reached into her bag and took out a notebook, leather, soft at the corners, the same kind she had carried for 30 years, and she turned to a section near the back marked with a tab she had cut from an index card a long time ago. There were pages in there about the Boyd house and the Caldwell counter. Coffee, black, 1 spoon sorghum, tin cup, beans before cornbread, hums when he's working a thing through. Don't talk to him before the 2nd cup. She had not opened those pages in 11 years. She had never torn them out either. She finished her shift. She clocked out at 3:45. She drove home to her apartment by the bus line and changed out of her uniform and went into her kitchen and put a pot of pinto beans on to soak, and that night she made them the way she remembered and a pan of cornbread in the cast iron her late husband had given her, and she packed it warm into a blue speckled tin and set her alarm for 5:30. She did not hurry. She was 56 and hurrying had never been her way. She arrived at things the way the season changes, not all at once, but completely. The next morning she drove to Mercy Greenville with the tin and a folding stool, because she had learned a long time ago that hospitals never have a chair where you need one. The woman at the desk on the neuro floor looked at her clean coat and her comfortable shoes and asked if she was family. Della said, no, she used to work for him. The woman said only family could visit in this unit. Della stood very still and asked, in a level voice, whether any family had visited in the last week. The woman looked at the screen, and the pause before she answered was its own answer, and then she said, let me get the doctor. Dr. Okafor came out 10 minutes later. She looked at the coat and the stool and the tin. She asked how long Della had worked for Mr. Boyd, and Della said she had cooked his counter 9 years. The doctor asked how well she had known him, and Della said, I know he takes his coffee black with a spoon of sorghum in a tin cup he won't let anybody throw out. I know he crumbles his cornbread into his beans and not the other way. I know he hums the same little piece of an old hymn when he's chewing on a problem and doesn't know he's doing it. I know he carried half the men in that town on a tab he never collected. I cooked for him 9 years, ma'am. The doctor was quiet a moment, and then she said, that is more than his children have told me in 9 days. She signed Della in herself and walked her down the hall. Walter was in the chair by the window. The light had just reached the armrest. He turned when the door opened and he looked at Della, and he did not know her. His face did not light, the way a face lights when it knows somebody, but it did not do what it had done with Grant and Sylvia either. It did not go polite and far away and empty. Something smaller happened. His brow shifted. His head tilted a half-inch, the way a man's head tilts toward a sound he can't quite place. He looked at her the way you look at a song you can't name but have heard before. She did not say who she was. She did not ask if he remembered. She set the stool down by the window and sat. She opened the tin on the bedside table. The smell of beans and cornbread filled the room, and Walter looked at it for a long time, and his good hand, which had been pressing the seam of the bedrail, went still. He picked up the spoon. He ate slowly, crumbling the cornbread into the beans without being told, and without knowing why his hands knew to. Della sat with her hands folded in her lap and looked out the window and did not watch him eat and did not ask if it was good. When the tin was empty, she closed the lid and folded the napkin and stood. She said, I'll come back tomorrow, and she walked out. Behind her, Walter pressed the call button. When Coretta came, he worked his mouth, and the words came out slow and slurred and certain. The woman, he said, she salts the beans right. It was the first full sentence anyone had heard him say in 9 days. Coretta wrote it in the chart, and underlined it once, and sat a minute at her station before she went on to the next room. The second day, Della brought the coffee, black with a spoon of sorghum, in a dented tin cup she'd found at a flea market for $1.50. It was not his cup, but it was the same kind of cup. Walter wrapped his good hand around it, and his fingers found the body of it and turned it once. Slow, the way fingers find a doorknob in a dark hallway they've walked 1,000 times. And he drank and said nothing, and Della sat and was quiet. By the 4th day, she had begun to talk. Not about the company, not the tower, not the trucks, small things, the things in the notebook. She told him about the hymn. He hummed and didn't know he hummed. She told him about the counter, how the framers came in muddy at 11, and he'd have her keep a plate warm for the old man who walked over from the boarding house and could never quite cover it. Walter listened, looking out the window. And then he turned his head and said, I know that song. And Della did not lean forward and did not say, You remember? She only nodded once and let the words sit where they were. On the 6th day, Dr. Okafor stopped her in the hall. She said that Mr. Boyd had been lining things up. The salt and pepper packets, the buttons of the call remote, by size, smallest to largest, over and over, and that he could not say why. Della said he had always done that she'd watched him square a fistful of screws on the counter while he talked to a supplier on the phone. The doctor nodded like a thing had been confirmed. Procedural memory, she said. The body keeps what the mind loses. It lives in a different part of the brain than the memory of events, down in the basal ganglia and the cerebellum, not up in the hippocampus where his language was hit. A man can lose every fact of his own life and still tie his shoes, still line up screws the way his hands learned 40 years ago, still feel safe in a room when the right person walks in and can't tell you their name. She looked at Della a while. "What you're doing in there isn't visiting," she said. "It's treatment. The brain heals on anchors, you're giving him anchors." On the 8th day, Della brought the hymn itself, played low from her phone on the bedside table, the old recording she'd cleaned the Caldwell counter to every Saturday morning for 9 years. Walter turned his head toward the sound the way a plant turns to a window, not by choosing to, by being made that way. His eyes closed. When it ended, he opened them and said one word: "Caldwell." Della nodded and pressed play again. 2 weeks in, Coretta mentioned to Grant on a routine call that his father's regular visitor was in the room if he'd like to leave a message. And Grant said, "What regular visitor?" And 40 minutes later, he and Sylvia came off the elevator together, walking fast. The way people walk when they have somewhere to be and something to stop. They found Della coming out of the room with the empty tin under her arm. Sylvia spoke first and asked what she thought she was doing there. Della said visiting. Sylvia said she didn't work for them. She'd been let go years ago. Della looked at her and said she'd been let go by their mother, not their father, and that she was not here for a paycheck. Grant lowered his voice into something meant to sound reasonable and said they appreciated her concern, but their father was in a fragile state, that having an unauthorized person spend hours in his room every day was not something the family was comfortable with. Dr. Okafor had come up the hall behind them and stopped and listened and let Grant finish. Then she said, "Ms. Mercer is the only consistent presence your father has had in 14 days. Her visits are not unauthorized. From where I stand, they are the only treatment in this building producing a measurable result. His verbal output is up. His blood pressure settles when she's in the room and climbs when it's full of strangers. I approved her, and I'll keep approving her." Sylvia said the woman had no legal standing to be there. The doctor said, "She has no legal standing. She also has no agenda. I can't say the same for everyone in this hallway." The corridor went very quiet. Marsh, who had appeared with his portfolio, said nothing at all because he had been a lawyer long enough to know a sentence, "You can't answer without making it worse." Grant and Sylvia went in to their father and stayed 22 minutes and came out without looking at Della, who had stood the whole time with the tin under her arm and her back straight, and her face calm, the way she had stood in a lot of rooms in her life where she'd been told she didn't belong. She went home and soaked the beans and set her alarm and came back the next morning, and the morning after that. The following week, she stopped bringing food and started bringing the man back to himself. She sat in the stool and told Walter Boyd about Walter Boyd. Not the version on the side of the trucks, the version in the notebook. The way he'd kept a tab open for men too proud to ask. The way he said thank you, not with his mouth but with his memory. How if you mentioned once that your boy was sick, 3 weeks later he would ask you how the boy was doing. And that was the whole of his thanks. The way he'd hummed that hymn over a busted ledger, like the answer was hiding in the next 6 notes. Walter listened, and the things she said did not come back to him as pictures. They came back as shapes. The shape of a man who opened the store before anybody because the quiet meant something. The shape of a man who carried people and let them keep their pride. "That sounds like somebody I'd want to be," he said one morning, and Della looked at him and said, "It's somebody you were." Down the hall, Dr. Okafor was teaching a resident over Walter's chart. "There's a notion that who you are lives in the memories you can recite," she said. "It's wrong. Identity is spread across systems. Events, yes, in one place. But emotion lives in the amygdala, and habit lives deeper than either. A man with his language stripped out can still feel his whole body ease when the safe person walks in, and tense when the others do, and never be able to tell you why. His amygdala is doing what it's always done. It's reading the room. He can't give you a single name. His body knows exactly who kept him alive. The resident asked how you measured a thing like that, and the doctor said you measured it on the monitors, in a heart rate that dropped every morning between 6:30 and 8, and that no pill in the pharmacy could do what a tin of beans was doing. The memory came back the way weather changes, in shifts and pieces and never on a schedule. On her 17th visit, the room was quiet. Not the empty quiet of the first 9 days, but the full kind. The kind two people make when they've learned the silence between them holds, Walter said, out of nothing. There was a store. It was closed. It was night. Della did not move. There was a desk, he said. I had my head down. I was sure I'd lost it all. He looked at his good hand. Somebody made me a plate. And sat. His voice had gone thick. They didn't ask me anything. They just stayed. He turned and looked at her, and his eyes had filled, and he said, "That was you." "Yes," Della said. "Nobody stays for the help at 11 at night," he said. "You weren't the help," she said. "You were a man in a store who needed somebody to sit with him. I was somebody who knew how to sit." His good hand had found the edge of the blanket and was squaring it, folding it slow into a clean small rectangle, and they both watched it do that. And something passed between them that needed no memory at all, because it had never been filed as a memory in the first place. It had been kept somewhere older and quieter. The plain fact that in the worst hour of his life one person had sat across from him and not looked away. 3 days later, the family came back with a second lawyer, a woman whose specialty was conservatorship, and asked Dr. Okafor to certify Walter incapacitated so that Grant could be made his guardian and all non-family visitors removed from his list. The doctor listened to the whole of it and then said she would not certify a man as incapacitated who could tell her what day it was, what he wanted for supper, and exactly who he did and did not want in his room, and that the court required her certification first, and she would not be signing it. That was when the voice came from the doorway. "I'm in the room," it said. Walter was standing there in his gown and robe, one hand on the IV pole, having walked the corridor himself. His face was calm and his voice was slurred and steady. "I can't tell you their names," he said, nodding at his children. "I couldn't tell you hers either, not for the longest time, but I know what I feel when each of you comes through that door." He looked at Grant, then Sylvia, then the lawyers. "When the two of you come in, I feel like a problem somebody's trying to close out. When she comes in, I feel like a person somebody's glad to see. That's not somebody fooling me, that's the difference, and I don't need my memory to know it." He said he would like them to go home, and he would like her to stay, and that if he had built a thing worth $100 million, then he could surely decide who sat in his hospital room. They went, and the lawyers went with them, and the room emptied, and the doctor stood in the hall and added nothing because there was nothing medical to add. He came back to himself the rest of the way over the next weeks. His name first, then the mill town, the sound of the feed store broom, then the desk in the dark, and the whole of that night. The memories that came back first were the ones with the deepest grooves, the ones that had cut. He learned his children's faces again, and learning them did not erase what he had felt when they were strangers. It only told him the feeling had been right. It was Della, in the end, who found the rest of it. She brought him the bag of his personal effects, the one cut from his pockets the day of the stroke and stored in the closet. His wallet. A money clip. And folded into the billfold. A slip of paper in his own hand. She unfolded it and read it and went very still. It said, "Find Della Mercer. Make it right." And below it a phone number that was 11 years old, and below that, in the same hand, the words, "A foundation for the people who do the work nobody sees." He had written it before the stroke. He had been looking for her. He held the paper and read his own intention back to himself, and then he reached over and pressed it into her hand. "I was coming back to you," he said. "I just didn't get there in time." Della looked at her own name in his handwriting. She folded the paper the careful way she folded everything and put it in the pocket of her coat. "You got there," she said. He was discharged 11 weeks after the stroke with most of his language back and a right hand that worked again if he was patient with it. He restructured the company. Grant and Sylvia were removed from the positions that had been made for them. They could come back, he told them, the way anyone earns a thing, from the bottom, from the loading dock, the way he had. "I gave you everything I never had," he told his son. "I never gave you the one thing that made all of it possible, which was knowing what it is to have nothing. That was my mistake. I'm correcting it late." Grant said that was going to be hard, and Walter said yes, it was. And he built the foundation. housing and clinics, and a hardship fund for the people who stock the shelves and run the registers and cook the counters and clean the rooms, the ones who hold up everybody else's life and never quite have enough left over for their own. He named it the Mercer Fund. Della told him he didn't have to put her name on it. He said he wanted the name of somebody who showed up because that was the entire point. 6 weeks after that, on a Saturday morning, Walter Boyd drove out to an apartment by a bus line and climbed one flight of stairs and knocked, and Della let him in without a word and stepped aside, and he sat down at a small table in a small clean kitchen with a window that caught the morning light, and she stood at the stove and made him beans and cornbread and poured black coffee with a spoon of sorghum into a dented tin cup, and she set it down and sat across from him. The light moved across the table. The coffee went cool. Neither of them said much, because some things have already been said by the staying. There is one question worth leaving you with, and it isn't about the money or the company or the stroke. It's about the person who showed up for you when nobody else did, who sat with you at the worst hour and didn't ask you to explain it, who remembered how you take your coffee after you'd forgotten your own name. If a face came to you while you were reading this, write their name down in the comments. Just the name. That's enough. That's everything. Every year, about 795,000 Americans have a stroke, and roughly a third of survivors live afterward with aphasia, the loss of language, the thing that took Walter's words. The science on this is real, and it is plain. The single most powerful medicine for a brain trying to find its way home is the steady, repeated presence of someone who knew it before. So if you know somebody in that fight right now, go sit with them. Bring the plate. Stay in the quiet. Because somewhere out there, somebody still remembers exactly how you take your coffee, and they are not finished with you yet. I keep going back to those 9 days when nobody came. A man builds 41 stores and a tower with his name on the glass. And when the worst morning of his life arrives, the room stays empty. I used to think a life like Walter Boyd's was protection. Now I think a balance sheet keeps you about as warm as a closed store at midnight. What gets me is that none of it was an accident. Grant and Sylvia didn't turn cold by bad luck. They were taught, year after year, that a person is only worth what they can collect, and children learn exactly what you show them. So when their father went quiet, they reached for the paperwork instead of his hand, because that was the only language anyone ever taught them to speak. You raise people on numbers. You shouldn't be surprised when they treat you like one. And Della. She didn't show up because she was owed anything. She showed up because of one night 11 years back when she chose to sit in a kitchen with a falling apart man and not ask him a single question. That small, quiet decency didn't pay her then. It paid her by making her the one person his ruined brain still trusted in the dark. Kindness like that doesn't vanish. It waits. It sits folded up somewhere until the day it's the only thing left standing. I've come to believe a real life is built out of 3 things, and money isn't one of them. The first is just doing right by people when it costs you something and nobody's watching. The way Della washed those dishes and never spoke of it again. The second is paying attention, learning to read a person well enough to know how they take their coffee and which silence means they're drowning. Because that kind of noticing is its own intelligence, and Walter spent his whole life noticing the men everyone else overlooked. The third is the plain stubbornness to keep showing up. Della cooked the beans, set the alarm, drove back the next morning and the next, while the lawyers came and went. She outlasted them by refusing to stop coming. That's the part I want to hold on to. Not the stroke, not the inheritance, not the fund he named after her. Just the truth that the people who matter are almost never the loudest ones in the room. They're the ones still in the chair when everybody with somewhere better to be has already gone. So I ask myself the only question worth asking. When my own bad morning comes, and it will, who's going to be sitting there with a plate and no questions? And maybe the better question, the one I can still do something about, is whether I've been that kind of person for anybody else yet.